Lux presents Hollywood. The Lux Radio Theater brings you Margaret O'Brien, James Craig, and Francis Gifford in Our Vines Have Tender Grapes.
Don't get me started.
Ladies and gentlemen,
one of the amazing things about radio, and you can hear this right now, is that today, if you buy or turn on a radio and connect to the AM band, the standard AM radio band, which you're all familiar with, news, sports, etc., you're listening to something that is the exact same technology that was used in 1920. This technology is 100 years old, and it is still going strong. It's the same thing. So what is a radio? So radio is really a technology, and it's the technology that involves using electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic waves in the radio spectrum for communication. And so what is the electromagnetic spectrum? Well, we have light. Light is an electromagnetic wave. It's a very short electromagnetic wave, and it's in the electromagnetic spectrum. Microwaves are in the electromagnetic spectrum. Infrared radiation, which is heat that comes from the earth or that your body is emanating right now, that's in the electromagnetic spectrum. But radio is also an electromagnetic wave that occupies a narrow band or narrowish band of the electromagnetic spectrum. So radio is a whole technology, and this thing we all call a radio is really not a radio. It's more technically referred to as a radio receiver. They're radio transmitters, they're radio receivers. Even when you're not listening to the radio or a radio waves are traveling through the air, through you, all around you, all the time. KOMO, Cairo, all the stations that you're familiar with from the Seattle area, from Bellingham, from Vancouver, they are all producing radio waves right now. And a radio is able to tune specific parts of that spectrum, amplify those waves, convert them to amplify those waves, convert them to audio, amplify them again so that you can hear them from a speaker. And so that's what a radio is. This is a radio receiver from 1942, and it's actually fairly modern. It's a very modern circuit. Not all that different from a radio that you might buy today in a store. One big difference, though, is that this radio makes use of vacuum tubes instead of transistors and chips, and that's a big difference. But fundamentally, a vacuum tube and a transistor do the same thing. They are amplifiers. They can be designed to do other kinds of things, like the TV tube that you're familiar with. When we used to have square box TVs instead of flat screen TVs, that tube is a vacuum tube. And then there were other vacuum tubes in those televisions, just as there are vacuum tubes in this radio. So this is actually playing. I'm going to turn it down. I'm going to turn it around just so you can see what is the magical things that are inside. And what we're looking at here is the chassis. And this is a vacuum tube. And this is a vacuum tube. And that's a vacuum tube. And these vacuum tubes are hot. It's one of the benefits of a transistor over a vacuum tube is that a vacuum tube actually uses a lot more energy than a transistor, but it fundamentally does the same thing. And this radio has 6 vacuum tubes in it, which is pretty typical. 5 or 6 or 7 are pretty typical. This radio was made in 1942 by Zenith Corporation. And it's been fully restored.
By you?
By me. And it works. Now, all this noise that you're hearing, all that noise, that's noise from the local environment. That's that's what your LED lights, the little power supplies you plug into the wall warts, that's what so much of the equipment in your house is generating. And sadly, the world is saturated by all this radio noise that is very hard to filter out. But when you get to a radio station, it's usually strong enough to win out over the noise. Let's see.
And are you on AM or FM?
This is AM radio, which was the standard way back when, and is still out there today. So let me just add one more thing. When you listen to your phone, listening to streaming music, that these streaming radio stations, you are in many ways not listening to radio anymore, because that information is streamed, it's not broadcast. But the irony of it is that your phone itself is a radio, that when you're using Wi-Fi and when you're using cellular service, you're using radio technology to do that communication. So there's an irony here. You're using radio to not use radio when you're listening to music, but you can do it the old-fashioned way, directly with a radio receiver.
Well, thank you very much for that, Norm. And Thomas wants to know more about your background. So why don't we start the interview and we can move this aside.
Should I turn this off?
Yeah, I think so.
Because we probably won't come back to it.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Close it back up. It's a really cool design.
Oh, it's not quite in there.
There we go.
It reminds me of the old Pullman luggage, the
Oh, yeah.
beautiful luggage case.
This was a portable.
Yeah.
It could run on batteries or on AC. And it's hardly what we would call a portable today, but this is the way it was. You take this to the beach.
Right. So now I'm going to move this over.
So my background was the question, I believe, right?
Yeah. So we're going to have you. Yes, your background, not the background physically, but tell us a bit about you.
So I grew up in upstate New York. My paternal grandparents had a giant console radio, a giant Philco. I mean, many of you have seen these things, if not in reality in the movies. Massive. And I remember as a child getting into the back of that thing and trying to play with it. I'm lucky I didn't I wasn't electrocuted, because vacuum tube radios use high voltages.
Oh, geez.
But anyway, that got me interested in radio, and I was very interested in science my whole life. And I got a geological sciences bachelor's degree at the State University of New York at Binghamton. And then from there went to Harvard, and I got my PhD at Harvard in 1983 in geological sciences. I was a professor of geological sciences until 1996 at Virginia Tech, at which point I decided I was writing a lot of software code to do the research I was doing. I decided that I would make that jump and move into the high-tech world of software. And through a couple of steps, I made my way to Microsoft, where I spent the last almost 20 years of my career, retiring just a couple of years ago. So yeah, that's my background in terms of radio and electronics technology. That's probably my main hobby. I'm completely self-taught. I have a library of all kinds of books from the 20s to the 50s that I've just devoured, and that's how I've learned what I know about this technology.
I have to say, I'm very sad to hear you taught at Virginia Tech, since I'm a UVA alum.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't realize that.
We loved you too.
Of course. My mother was distraught that I went to Virginia, actually. She wanted me to go to Tech. That was great. Thank you. And then what specifically got you started in the radio? Was it just crawling around in the back of that radio?
So that was the first thing. And I was thinking about that as I was driving in today. I was thinking about what were the other influences, but my other side of my family, well, my paternal grandparents had that giant radio, and I happen to know that the 3 bedrooms that they had each had a small portable radio. And I don't know why, I would, fixate on these things, but it was something that I did from when I was a child. I had an inventory of the radios in their house, each of which was a vacuum tube radio. when transistors were coming in. And so I thought these were the coolest things. They just seemed more alive, more interesting. They were warm. They were, you know, they weren't just these cold little boxes that turned on immediately. You had to warm them up. And then on my mother's parents, they happened to have a big hi-fi in the living room. It was a monophonic system. It was before stereo. And they also had a tiny white transistor radio, and both of those just fascinated me. So, you know, I can't, it's not obvious how I became interested, but having those objects there spurred, you know, some kind of latent interest in me. But I've always been interested in science, technology, how things work, engineering, space, just things, you know, the ways of the world.
And can you still get parts in order to do these beautiful restorations?
So the answer is yes. There's a short answer, there's the long answer. The short answer is, for the most part, yes. Vacuum tubes are still available, because when in the 80s and 90s, you know, many TV and radio shops, you know, shut their doors. Some people, you know, had the vision to aggregate parts and tubes from these retiring professionals, thinking that maybe hobbyists would want to buy them. And indeed, there are several companies that have accumulated huge stockpiles of tubes.
Oh.
So vacuum tubes are all available. Vacuum tubes are also made today in Russia and China. I don't think anybody's making vacuum tubes in the US. There's a company in Germany making vacuum tubes. And vacuum tubes technology has not gone away. It is alive and well in the form of very high-end audio equipment, high fidelity equipment, and guitar amplifiers. So vacuum tubes are pretty common. There's some, you know, extreme rarities, and I have a few rare ones, but they're pretty common. So in these radios, they use common vacuum tubes, and they are readily available. You may not realize this, but hundreds of thousands of vacuum tubes were made a week by companies like RCA and Philco, and you know, several others. Hundreds of thousands. That's how, you know, how important they were in the world. Now, other parts are also readily available. Resistors, capacitors, those are standard parts that are still used today. Where things get difficult is parts that are unique to that radio.
Oh.
So the parts that would be unique to that radio would be something like, you know, this part, some part of the cabinet, or even knobs, or the dial face. And these things do get damaged. These things are damaged sometimes. And internally, there are other parts that are, you know, that are unique to that radio. And if they fail, it's very difficult to remedy.
So speaking of vacuum tubes, what do they do?
Well, I would say the simplest way to explain a vacuum tube is that it's an amplifier. So why do you need an amplifier? The radio signals that are beamed out all around, that are going through your body and through your coffee cup right now, are in the microvolt range, thousands of a volt. Okay, that's why you're not being electrocuted. They're just tiny little varying AC voltages. And in order to generate the sound that comes out of a speaker, you need to amplify that microvolt signal to something that on the order of watts. Because if you know anything about audio, you know, and have some audio speakers, you know that your speaker, your audio amplifier produces several watts, maybe even hundreds of watts. That's what you need for audio. So you need to take these microvolt signals that are produced in terms of power, it's microwatts of power, and you need to convert that to watts of power. Vacuum tubes do that. That's the simplest way to describe them. They can be designed for other kinds of things, but if there's one takeaway for what a vacuum tube does, it's that it amplifies signals.
So if I or anyone in our lovely audience has an old radio at home, should they just plug it in and see if it'll work?
Don't do that. There are a few reasons why you shouldn't do it. One is the safety standards of these things, of radios, have changed. First of all vacuum tubes use high voltages. The voltages in here on these vacuum tubes are on the order of 150 to 200 volts. Okay, your wall plug produces 110 volts of AC. In here, that AC is converted to DC and it's stepped up to a higher voltage. Those voltages can kill you, and there are certain shortcuts that were taken during from the 30s to the 50s to maybe the early 60s that could make the chassis inside electrically hot. In other words, if you touch the metal chassis inside like I'm doing, you could get a shock. You could get a lethal shock. So often line cords are all broken and frayed. There are a lot of reasons for not just plugging this thing in. Safety is one of them. You could start a fire, or you could electrocute yourself. More likely, though, is that it just won't work, or it won't work well. And that's because all radios contain capacitors, and they all age, and they kind of fail after 30 to 40 years, and they need to be replaced. So the advice that I would give is, if you have an old radio and you want to put it back into service, or you haven't used it for a long time, and you want to see if it works, you need to consult with somebody who knows about how to put these back into service safely, so that you can enjoy them for another 101 years.
Golly. And those vacuum tubes look very delicate. How do people avoid breaking?
They're surprisingly, let me unplug this before I start sticking my hands in there, right?
Yeah. You saw it here, folks.
So here's a typical vacuum tube. And they really are not that delicate. Here, you can handle it. You can probably drop it on the floor. They're quite resilient, and the glass is fairly thick. The base is sturdy. The internal components are made of various metals. They're welded, spot welded in there. They look quite delicate, but they're very sturdy. And I mean, you can't throw them like a baseball, but these things during World War II were used in aircraft, and for radios, for other things. They were used in very rugged situations, and in the field, the military, took radios into the field, and you can imagine them bouncing around on these trucks. Right. And there were ruggedized versions of tubes, but they are tougher than you think, and they rarely go bad. So often, if you find an old radio, a lot of times people will say, "Oh, it must be probably has a bad tube. It's not working." That's rarely the case. It rarely has a bad tube. The vacuum tubes last a very long time, and they can last for many thousands of hours. So they're very rugged, much more rugged than you might think.
Did you have anyone in your family who was a radioman in the war?
Well, my father was a radar technician, and he was in, among other places, Pagua, Canada, which was part of the Pine Tree Line, which was the predecessor of the DEW line, the DEW, the Distant Early Warning Line. I'm not sure anybody even remembers this stuff, but during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we had a set of radar installations in Canada. The US ran them in collaboration with the Canadian government. And these were early warning systems to detect Soviet incursions from over the pole. One of these was the Pine Tree line, and then the next one, later one that was further north, was called the Dew line. And my father was a radar technician on the Pine Tree line, and he used to tell a story about how he was one of the first 3 people on the site, and they had built a site in a very remote area near Hudson Bay, and he was transported to the site. I think they were flown there, and then one day a helicopter came in and they dropped boxes onto the site, and that was the radar set that they needed to put together to get the site running. So
cool.
he had an interest in it, and not anywhere near as you know, long standing as my interest.
Let's see, is there still programming for old radios?
Well, we just were listening to this, and as I mentioned, but is worth repeating because it's so amazing. The same radio technology has been used for the last 100 years. And so every one of these old radios, the ones that I have here in the case from 1920, forgot about these, 1924, 1950, about 1950, the 1940s, 1924, 1927, 1942, 1957. Every one of these radios, if you turn them on today, will receive broadcasts. The broadcasts that that you would receive if you went to Walmart and bought a radio. It's the same technology. It's very rare that the same technology has been is used in the same way for so long. You can't even imagine using an IBM PC from 1982 today and having it connect to the internet or have it do anything useful. But any one of these radios, if you know how to make them work, can do something useful.
As a kid, what was your favorite radio show?
Oh gosh. I think the one I listened to the most was Saturday morning. It was like the Hit Parade or something like that, where they would count down. It was a music thing. They would count down songs to number one, and I would always try to guess, what the songs were. And I think that was because I grew up post the period when you had the classic radio programs, the Ozzie and Harriet. Those programs had moved to television by that time. So by the 1960s, I was born in 1957. So by the mid 60s, when I was really getting into this stuff, TV is where you would go for those sitcoms and things. No longer on radio, or very little. But radio had moved into the music arena mostly, and I would always listen to that countdown and try to get that, to guess the number one radio
in the early
number one song.
The Billboard.
There were several. I mean, there was, I don't remember the names now. Gosh.
That's okay. I remember in the mid 60s, my sister and I, we would go to bed at night. At 10 o'clock, we'd listen to Mystery Theater.
Oh yeah.
In the dark.
And
it scared me to death.
Yeah.
She loved it. Oh my God. And I found an archive of all the old shows on the internet, where everything lives.
Yeah, there's a lot out there for sure.
Yeah. And where do you find old radios now?
Well, let me answer the question about where did I find them before, and then where do we find them now. So back in around 1980 or so, when I really started collecting and restoring, it's 40 years ago, I would find them in antique shops, places that would, like barns that would sell farm implements. My wife and I would, when we were at Harvard, we would drive to Western Massachusetts and try and take in all the antique stores that we saw along Route 2 along the way. And because that part of the country was populated, and developed so early in the history of the country, there were lots of old artifacts there, and lots of old radios. You could find them in barns and places like that, and buy them at very reasonable rates, like very, very little. But since in the interim, the hobby has become much more developed, and there are a lot of people who are interested in old equipment like this, old radios. Having one for their house, using them as props in movies and other things like that. They're very popular, and they're harder to find. They're not that hard to find, but they're expensive. So eBay is one place where is kind of an obvious place. Etsy is another place. What I've noticed is that many of the radios that you get now in places like that, not only are they fairly expensive, they've been in some way, restored. And I almost put that in air quotes, because sometimes these restorations are not very good. And the holy grail is to be able to discover a radio or TV, whatever you're trying to restore, whatever you're looking for, to find one that hasn't been tampered with, find one that's in the original condition with the original capacitor, the original parts, because then you know what you're working with, and you know that you can systematically go through and get that thing restored. But there are fewer and fewer of those now. They're fairly rare. Most of them have been restored in some way or another, and it's rare, in my judgment, when you get one that has been restored. It's rare for one to be restored well. Often things are, just not done very well. The soldering is not very good, or sometimes there were modifications to the radio, and those are things you don't want. But they are still out there.
And so if everyone on this show is super excited about radios now and wants to learn more, where would they go? Well,
there's a lot of places. If you do a search on the web, vintage radio, you will find there are hundreds and hundreds of websites. There are websites for where people that have forums on them, where people are asking questions of each other regarding restorations. In fact, I used one of those just yesterday. That's antiqueradios.org. And then there are many, many others. I would just, rather than, I'm not really prepared to give you a list of websites, but if you do a search on antique radio or old radio or vintage radio or radio restoration, you will find more than you can read in your entire life. And near the top of that search will be some of the primary places to go and look.
And are there clubs?
There are clubs all across the country and all around the world, in fact. And one of those clubs is the Puget Sound Antique Radio Association.
Oh,
yeah, which has been around for a very long time. And I'm a member, and I was a vice president for a number of years. But when I moved to Orcas Island, I became much less active, because they are located in Seattle. But they do have Zoom meetings now because of the pandemic. So there are clubs.
oh, that's
Yeah,
terrific.
there may be 100 members of that club, and I'd say that at the monthly meetings we would have 20 to 30 attendees each time. Always the same. Always the same.
Hardcore.
Yeah.
Well, let me open it up to the audience. And does anyone have any questions you'd like to put in the chat window, or take yourself off mute and ask Norman?
I'll ask Norman. Can you go over the radios that are in the display, but also what are some of the materials that the casing is made out of radios and so forth?
I'll be glad to. So,
thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to. So this one up here is a Feta, which was a common brand in the 40s and 50s, and that has a beautiful small wood case, and it's mahogany. Yeah, sure. As long as the glass doesn't fall out.
No.
So this is a beautiful little mahogany case. It's a mahogany veneer. There are wood solids beneath the veneer, and at the bottom you see this band of this accent band. That is actually a kind of applique. It's paper or plastic that adds a little bit of pizzazz to it. The knobs are Bakelite, which was one of the early plastics, and Bakelite is a brand, and it's still produced today. So that's pretty typical and beautiful. And wood has been used for a very long time. So that was from the 1940s. This radio here is an Atwater Kent Model 10C, which was made in 1924. And yes, this is the way it was sold. It's called a breadboard radio, where the components are on the top. The base is mahogany, and it's a mahogany solid. It's solid mahogany. The parts are mostly metal of some sort, sometimes aluminum, usually steel. And the tuning capacitors here are Bakelite. Bakelite was used all the time because Bakelite, being a plastic, is fairly easy to mold. This from 1924, this is an RCA Radiola 3 and RCA Radiola 3 balanced amplifier. Has a mahogany case with a dark walnut stain, and then a Bakelite control panel, vacuum tubes, Bakelite knobs, some metal parts. This one down here, we call it a metal box radio, and it is called the metal box radio. This is an Atwater Kent model from 1927, and it's metal. It's some are brass, but I think this is steel with a coating of like a crackle finish coating on it, which many of you are familiar with. Bakelite knobs. What else do we have? I guess let's come over to this side. Uh-oh.
All right.
There we go. So this guy back here is a Stuart Warner, and it's from 1939, and this is all Bakelite. You're very easily molded into really, really beautiful shapes. This one is interesting because this is a Zenith. This thing flips down, the top flips down. I'll show you. And it closes and becomes a portable. It's really cool. And the dial stands up like that. This thing is made of like a very inexpensive wood covered with a fabric that the closest equivalent today is called Tolex, T-O-L-E-X, which is a brand. It's a tough leather-like fabric. It's not vinyl. It's more paper-like, because I've actually had to do some restoration of it. A metal grill here for covering the speaker. These are plastic. I don't know if they're Bakelite or not. Bakelite is usually brown. It doesn't have to be brown, but it usually is brown. This is a more modern plastic, and this clear plastic is a reproduction because the original one was broken. And this is a clear plastic, and it was originally a clear plastic with a metal medallion. I mean, huge expense went to make these things in a lot of ways, and a lot of artistic talent and thought. Just the medallion itself is notable. And then the last one, a couple more. This one down here is a pretty famous radio. This was used during World War II. It was very popular. This was a Zenith transoceanic bomber, it was called. And on the front, if you can, I don't know if you can see the pattern, but the grill cloth has an airline. It looks like a DC-3. Has a bomber pattern in it. And this was the originals in 1942 had sailboats on them, sort of like this. Yeah. Like this one here, which was a sailboat. Mm-hmm. But once the war broke out, they switched this to show a bomber. And this is fabric, and it's just stitched fabric. And this is the famous transoceanic bomber radio that was really popular with GIs. It was sent to GIs. It's very heavy, actually. It has shortwave, it has AM. It's a pretty cool radio, and it has all these awesome graphics too. A map showing there's a time of day chart, and then there are operating instructions. It's just very cool. I mean, it's very cool for the geeky person among us, because it talks about how the circuit works and that kind of thing. Another one, just two more. Then I'm going to cover that. Will cover all of them. This radio here is from 1924, and it's called the Crosley Pup. Crosley was a very common brand of radio. They even made refrigerators, and in fact, there was a Crosley airplane. Now that I think about it, it didn't last. But this is a Crosley Pup. It's a one-tube radio, vacuum tube radio. You need to hook a bunch of batteries up to make it work and to hook up these headphones. This has a very inexpensive metal case, and the case has a crackle paint
This
finish
is the tube?
on it, and that's the tube.
And there was nothing protecting it?
No, that was it.
Wow.
They're pretty tough.
Yeah.
This is actually a fairly rare tube, but Crosley Pup was $15 in its day. Okay, and I paid $15 for it.
Oh, wow.
Probably 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago. It is now a much more valuable radio than that, because it's quite rare, and it was sold to children mostly in 1924, so a child could have a radio, and many of them just were thrown out or destroyed, or in some way damaged, and they're gone, so they're quite rare. Yeah, one more. I'm gonna just one more. Then,
Yeah, and the one on top.
yeah, that one right there, which is that one that looks like a more, like, kind of come over here.
Mhm.
This is a Zenith transistor radio. This is one of the few transistor radios that I have in my collection. This one's from 1957, which is the year of my birth, which
Nice.
is one reason it's interesting. But it's also a very, let's see, where am I here? Very good quality radio. Oops. It has, well, it may not work well because of all the radio noise here. The LEDs are terrible, really add a lot of radio noise. But it's a very well-made radio. This has a leather case on the outside, and well, maybe let's try it.
And we can turn the other.
Don't go away. We're still here. Well, it's okay. I hesitate to rock the boat too much and lose our lighting.
Right.
So anyway, that radio was made in 1957, and it has a leather case and a really nice, painted. It's painted steel escutcheon, the small knobs, and inside it's transistors, but it's the transistors are in a very solid metal chassis. It's really well made, and that's battery operated radio. You can just carry it with you. Oh, I forgot about that one.
Oh, sorry, we'll have to go like this guy up here.
So this one, which reminds me of those things too.
Yes.
So this one is a 1932 Atwater, Kent, model 82 Cathedral radio. So it's an iconic design. Most people have seen Cathedral radios somewhere. It is fairly modern in the way it works. It's a modern super heterodyne, that's the type of circuit receiver, and it works really beautifully. It has a really kind of a big speaker in there. It has a mahogany case with some walnut accents. That's walnut veneer. This is mahogany. That's not a veneer, that's actually mahogany. Then other kinds of veneers and wood solids. Again, a lot of thought and design expertise went into these things, and I can't help but think a lot of expense went into the tooling to be able to build these things at scale, and they're just absolutely beautiful. They're works of art as well as works of technology. These guys up here, which I forgot all about, these are some of the speakers that were used during the 20s. So this speaker here, it's an RCA speaker. That is the speaker that you used with this radio. That speaker up there is the speaker that you would use with this Atwater Kent breadboard radio. And yeah,
And where did this one go to?
so this speaker goes with this radio. Yeah, they actually came together. Often you bought the speaker and the radio separately, the speaker and the receiver separately, but I'm pretty sure these two, they actually came together. It's the same color and yeah.
We have some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Let's see. Thomas McDonough says he's a collector too,
Oh, yeah.
and a former broadcaster.
Wow.
And Julie would like to know, well, we did that. We gave a review of everything in the case and what makes them, oh, and she asks, are any radios made in the US anymore?
Oh. I hesitate to say no, because there could be one. I mean, but I think the answer is no. But even if I'm wrong, there was a great migration of American technology out of the US, this kind of technology during the 60s, 70s, and 80s to Japan first, and then more broadly to Korea, to South Korea, and elsewhere. So there are very few that are made in the US today. Now I do want to say one thing. It's not like Americans have, or the US has lost all its technology. Some of the very best, some of the very best audio equipment is made in the US. So at the very, very high end, not so much radio receivers where they have tuning, but audio equipment, the US is a huge leader.
What companies would we recognize?
Well, Macintosh is one. Macintosh is a company that started in Binghamton, New York, and has been there since 1949. That happens to be where I grew up. They make high-end audio equipment, amplifiers that cost $15,000, that kind of thing. There are people on this call who were familiar with that company.
Gotcha.
Krell, Mark Levinson, many, Paradigm. I can go on and on. If there are enthusiast magazines and things where if you get these every month, you can have this long list of names of amazing manufacturers, many of them US manufacturers.
Is there a magazine about radio we should have in the library?
I'm not aware of one. There's one that you do need, which is called ARRL, American Radio Relay League. That's the standard Bible for amateur radio, what we sometimes call ham radio. And I know there's a ham radio club on the island, and you may even have it. And I'm not exactly sure what the name of it is, but it's the bulletin put out by the American Radio Relay League, ARRL. And that's definitely a standard.
Well, we do have a question here from Mike asking if you would consider starting a radio station broadcast from Orcas, and what would that entail?
Well, that would be a big job. The answer is, would I consider it? No. There's quite a big, capital outlay to start a radio station, or to start a radio station. And I don't think I have the expertise. I mean, to do it. I would know something about the technology, but I know nothing about content programming. Don't ask me about radio programs. I mean, to me, it's all about the technology. I mean, I'm interested, but I don't have enough knowledge. You need more breadth. Of course, you could assemble a team that has that breadth.
Sounds like we have a few people on the call. Thomas could help.
Yeah. So there are, a fair number of small radio stations that have just a few people working for them, or even very few. And I have a cousin who owns several radio stations, and a lot of it is automated. The radio is, or the broadcast is, or the programming is computerized, and it just runs on a timer. Then there are a number of small shortwave broadcasters, a lot of religious broadcasting on shortwave, and these are very small operations, and they're very low wattage, maybe 1,000 watts.
I think Lopez has a station actually. The librarian over there used to go and do a show on their radio.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me. It's doable, but it's quite a commitment. You need to keep it going.
Right.
You can't just say, "Oh, I'm gonna build a radio station," and then you build it and walk away. You have to be there it's like running a business. You have to be there every day and keep developing new programming and keep working with the audience and, identifying your, the sweet spot of what your programming is and keeping the technology running and building a big antenna somewhere. It's a big operation.
Non-constitution.
Yeah.
Someone asks about the books in the display.
So these books are from my personal library of electronic books. So this is a little bit tricky. And this is one of my favorites, but I have a library of electronics books from the 20s to the 50s, maybe into the 60s, on radio, television, engineering. This is a famous engineering book. It's called Radio Engineering by Terman, who was a Stanford professor and very, very well known in developing the theory of modern radio, among probably second only to Edwin Armstrong in developing radio technology, or the theory of radio technology. Anyway, I have a bookcase as big as this filled with electronics library books, classic texts from way back in the heyday, and it's full of circuits.
Oh yeah.
And I'm just randomly, showing you pages.
Equations.
You have to, you have to be a certain sort to get into this stuff. But if you really want to understand and even restore, I always say that there's nothing more practical than theory. If you know how something works, that takes you a long way to figuring out how to fix it, how to build your own. As I said before, lots of restorers, they don't really know how the radios work. They don't really know what the parts do. They just will change out parts in the hope that they'll make it work. And that's not a very systematic way to do it, but to do it systematically, you do need to, do your homework.
We have another question. Julie asks, do the portable radios in the case use the same type of batteries we use today, A, C, D, and 9 volt?
Right. So great question. This one uses, I believe, 4 C-cell batteries. None of the others use the same batteries. So the one that I demonstrated first, this guy, I'll turn it around, show you what the inside looks like again. And at the bottom went the battery. And so there was a battery that was a block that was, I guess, about 12 inches long, about 6 inches wide, about 3 inches thick. And that block had multiple cells in it. You would buy them like RCA radio batteries. And this would plug into that, and it would feed the voltages needed for these tubes. So these tubes use a 90 volts and 1.1 volts, or actually 9 volts. So in that battery pack would be a 90 volt section and then a 9 volt section in this radio. In these really old radios, let me just back up or close that part by saying, at least you could buy one battery, at a radio store, and it was basically a carbon battery, and it would last, maybe a few hundred hours, and then you'd have to get a new one. But with these really old radios from the 1920s, this one Some of these were plug-ins, but this was a battery operated radio. It was all very different. So this radio requires a 5-volt battery for the tubes. And they didn't make 5-volt batteries, but you used a 6-volt car battery. So for the filaments of the tubes, the parts of the tubes that glow, for those of you who remember tubes, they have this glowing part called the filament. You use a 6-volt car battery. In addition to the 6-volt car battery, you also need 22 volts for the plates. That's another component of the tube, the plates of these tubes, and then 90 volts for the plates of another tube. And those usually were 2 other batteries. So you'd have a 22.5-volt battery, which was smallish like that, and then a 90-volt battery, which is usually bigger for that. And so if you were to set this up with batteries, you need a whole shelf for the batteries. And the 90-volt and the 22-volt batteries would last quite a long time, but the 6-volt batteries were for the filaments, used a lot of power, and you had to have those recharged. And just like when I grew up, the milkman would come once a week to deliver milk to the house. In the 1920s, between 1924 and 1927 or so, there was a battery truck that came around and went house to house every week or 2 weeks on a schedule, changing out those car batteries, providing a recharged car battery to run these radios. Not surprisingly, this kind of radio became obsolete pretty quickly as soon as it became practical to use wall current power, which happened in 1927. So this radio here is the very first radio that Atwater Kent produced that you could just plug into the wall. That was a huge advantage. Yeah, thanks.
And I remember we talked earlier and you said that the ability to use wall current would have happened much sooner, except for...
Well, it wasn't easy to do.
Yeah. Wasn't there also the whole...
There were a few things.
Yeah.
Not everybody had AC current to the house. Some houses had no electric power at all. Some had DC, some had AC. So that was an issue. Without power at all, you need to use batteries. If you use DC, you need a different kind of circuit than if you use AC. But when AC became the standard, there was still DC even until the 50s and 60s. And even today, there's still some remnant DC utility power. But it required the development of a special tube called a rectifier tube to convert AC to DC. Everything in these radios, everything in your phone, all the electronics in your house except for your lights, and even now even your LED lights now, believe it or not, they run on DC. They don't use AC. When you plug something in, for the most part, except for standard incandescent lights, when you plug something in, current flows to a power supply inside whatever you're powering up that converts AC to DC. That is almost universal. When we turn on these radios and you're hearing that noise, what you're hearing is AC being converted to DC. It produces this awful noise. Anyway, it took until about 1927 to develop a practical way to convert AC to DC to be able to power the tube filaments, and that's the main reason. But of course, once that happened, immediately everybody switched over.
Sure. Let's see. Do we have any other questions I've missed here in the chat? Anybody want to unmute and ask any other questions?
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure. I could go on and on.
Do you know each other?
I don't know.
Tom?
No, we don't, but I want to.
Oh, very kind of you.
That's Thomas McDonough.
Mm-hmm.
And let me ask a few general questions. How did you guys like having an early morning program? Is this something that you would do again with a cup of coffee?
I think Wake Up with Carol really works.
terrific. I'll have to start getting my content ready. Golly. And how did most of you hear about this?
Facebook for me.
Facebook. Okay. I'm always trying to figure out if the social media is actually working, and or if people come and find out, or by word of mouth, or by coming to the library. Everyone's saying thank you, Norman.
You're welcome.
Oh,
Thank
library
you.
newsletter. Good.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and if you have any other ideas about programs you'd like to learn about over a cup of coffee, let me know. If you have any other friends or yourselves have collections you'd like to share, we'd love to facilitate that. So thanks to everyone for coming out this morning and your jams or whatever. And thank you very much, Norman. It's been great. Really
Well, it's been my
appreciate
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You bet. And the display case has been super popular.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. It was fun to set it up.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye. There we go. Well done.
All right.
Everyone says thank you.
Good night.
Our sponsors, the makers of Lux Toilet Soap, join me in inviting you to be with us again next Monday evening when the Lux Radio Theater presents Loretta Young and Brian Ahern in the Barretts of Wimpole Street. This is William Keighley saying good night to you from Hollywood.